whole thing gets started with the Boston Bar Association and the white paper that got written. There was a small group of people, including a few consultants, but mainly lawyers, who decided that it was time to let DEP know how unhappy we were with the regulatory system as it existed at the time. So we had a number of meetings, and the outcome of those meetings was a white paper which was signed by, I think, about 12 people and submitted to the department. Jim Coleman just said his blood pressure went up a few points when he first received and read that document. Remember that?
Yeah, actually, one of the things I found in my archives with Chris Davis's letter inviting us to the party, in which he indicated that DEP had actually asked the BBA's Hazardous Waste Committee for suggestions, despite the fact that DEP had actually invited us to comment. As Jim said, his blood pressure went up a little bit. Perhaps there were more comments there and broader comments than DEP was ready for at the time, but at the end of the day, it worked out very well for us.
Yeah, it really woke them up and started us down a path that has led us to the situation that we have today, but it's definitely an improvement. And what else did the study committee come up with?
Well, that of course was a big thing, because that was the game changer. And then a lot of the discussion after that was how you implement something like that.
A number of factors conspire to say this is broken and we need to figure out a way to deal with it.
I mean, everybody was united by the fact that it wasn't working for them.
I think what we saw happening was this confluence of a wide range of people in the real estate community, in the banking community, in the environmental community, saying something needs to get fixed.
They all kind of put their prejudices, hung them up at the door when they walked in, and really got down and rolled up their sleeve and said, we have a real problem, we have to fix this.
What we had found when we were working with DEP on the investigation and clean up the sites that we were concerned about, we found that DEP was really listening to us. They didn't have the resources to address the issues, but they did involve us. They kept us informed of what was going on. And so we felt welcomed when the negotiations were taking place for the regulations. But we were a very small voice amongst a sea of environmental professionals and environmental attorneys and representatives of the responsible parties. And we felt that we were really going to it was going to be an uphill battle to really have our voice heard. But we really did find out is DEP made sure that there was a balance of opinions in all of the subcommittees. And as we got to know the environmental professionals and the environmental attorneys, for the most part, we finally began to realize that they really were concerned about what was going on and what needed to be addressed. And we started to work sort of hand in hand with them.
What I remember is that it was the gentleman who was representing MassPerg who listened to all the complaints all the way around about consultants and how we were spending all of our time trying to get them to do what we thought needed to be done for a site. They were spending their time trying to get their clients to pay for that, and a lot of times the clients didn't want to pay for it. And finally, the gentleman from MassPerg, Rob Sargent, said, well, why don't we just license the consultants? So we have people working on making the decisions about these sites with a common base of training and level of experience.
When we first heard about that, we thought, this is nuts. You're going to give responsibility for cleaning up, for investigating and cleaning up sites to the very people who caused the sites in the first place. And you're going to license their consultants to do this work for you.
We identified all the right people on this. We had a number of people representing all of the interests, and we tried to get principal parties. So we didn't have the real estate board. We had a vice president of Hunneman Real Estate. One of the first things we tried to set up in these meetings, and they went on for a year or a year and a half, was we all need to bring everything to the table here. We need to be willing to not assume that we're just going to tinker around the edges. We need to think hard about what's the most important thing to get done here. And I think two principles emerged pretty quickly. One of those was everybody agreed that the state should be focusing its resources on the sites that pose the greatest risk to public health. And that meant we shouldn't necessarily have to focus a lot of our staff time on a contaminated former gas station, which did have some contamination in it, but for which the responses were fairly routine and for which the risks were pretty low. There were no water supplies nearby, and there weren't schools next door, for example. So that was one thing. We needed to be able to focus our staff, our attention on the worst sites. And the second thing was that we needed to figure out a way to move beyond every single site getting approval from the state before it could go back into commerce. That was in some ways the tricky part.
We talked a lot about suspending disbelief.
This was, as you might guess, a rare occurrence in the experience of anybody in the legislature to have one of the leading environmental advocacy groups and the Banking Association agreeing on something like this.
I ran the team that put the final Massachusetts contingency plan, the MCP, together in 1993.
The key thing was using this advisory committee to build consensus that this package, as a package, was going to make a difference.
We had to have it into the State House by July 1st of 93 in order to have it published and make it effective in October of 93, which was the deadline. And we finished it at 3 a.m. on the day of it had to be delivered.
Basically, the legislation went through as a single package, which was not tampered with along the way, because there was such strong effort to get all the parties to buy into it. And unfortunately, if you pulled out one thread from that fabric, the whole piece might have fallen apart.
You're familiar with the document. It is immense. It has tremendous, it had many, many new ideas, new concepts. The risk assessment piece particularly, that was something that was unheard of in Massachusetts certainly, and I think nationwide at the time.
The study committee was one of the most congenial, respectful groups of people from disparate interests working together. They all came there with good intentions and goodwill. They had certainly disagreements, the environmentalists and the bankers and the realtors.
Everybody had to give up a little bit in that. Some people wanted things that other people didn't want. Sometimes there were differences of opinion even amongst the private sector about the banks may have wanted more of a certification process from DEP initially than the engineers thought should happen.
The very fact that we did it was amazing, and the very fact that I was able to work with these very young people at the time, 20 years ago, many of them still with DEP, who were given free rein to just create and brainstorm and do stuff that never had been done in environmental circles before, and sit down with a blank page, create it, think it, sell it, go to public meetings, convince.
As we got to know the environmental professionals and the environmental attorneys, for the most part, we finally began to realize that they really were concerned about what was going on and what needed to be addressed. And we started to work sort of hand in hand with them.
And we convinced them that this process with these licensed parties could provide them with the certainty and the protection that indeed they were safe. And to this day, it has been quite successful.